It was a busy Friday morning at Los Angeles International Airport. The sun had barely risen, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. Terminal B was already bustling with well-dressed travelers, their designer luggage rolling across the polished floors. Flight AA 2547 to New York was preparing for boarding, and the first-class lounge was filled with its usual mix of business executives and wealthy passengers. Among the crowd stood Catherine Wheeler, a 45-year-old fashion executive known for her sharp tongue and sharper taste in clothing. She adjusted her perfectly pressed Chanel suit and checked her gold watch for the third time in 5 minutes. Around her, other first-class passengers displayed similar signs of wealth: expensive watches, designer bags, and carefully styled hair. First-class passengers for Flight AA 2547 to New York. Please proceed to Gate B15 for priority boarding, the announcement echoed through the terminal. Catherine led the way, her red-bottomed Louboutins clicking against the floor. Behind her, a group of investment bankers in tailored suits discussed their latest market predictions. The first-class line was a parade of luxury and importance, exactly as she thought it should be. Just as boarding began, a man quietly joined the first-class line. He wore worn blue jeans, a simple black t-shirt that had seen better days, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. His shoes were scuffed, and he carried a basic black backpack that looked like it came from a regular department store. Catherine's perfectly plucked eyebrows rose in disapproval. "Excuse me," she said loudly, tapping the man's shoulder. "This is the first-class line." Her tone made it clear she thought he was in the wrong place. The man simply nodded and gave a small smile. "Yes, I know. Thank you," he said softly, his voice kind despite her rudeness. He turned back around, leaving Catherine flustered and even more annoyed. As they boarded the plane, the first-class cabin buzzed with quiet conversations and the sound of bags being stored in overhead compartments. The casually dressed man made his way to seat 2A, a window seat in the front of the first-class section. Catherine's eyes widened in disbelief when she realized her seat, 2B, was right next to him. "This must be some kind of mistake," she muttered loud enough for others to hear. Several passengers looked over, and soon whispers spread through the cabin. Two investment bankers smirked and shook their heads. A woman in an expensive silk dress wrinkled her nose as she walked past. The man seemed unbothered by the attention. He carefully placed his backpack under the seat in front of him and pulled out a worn paperback book. The cover was folded back, making it impossible to see what he was reading. He settled into his seat quietly, appearing completely at ease despite the judgmental glances being thrown his way. A flight attendant approached with pre-flight drinks. "Would you like champagne, sir?" she asked the man politely. "Just water, please." "Thank you," he replied with a gentle smile. This only seemed to confirm Catherine's beliefs about him being out of place. "I'll have the champagne," Catherine announced, making sure her voice carried. "Veuve Clicquot, I assume." She emphasized the French pronunciation, throwing a sideways glance at her seatmate's simple water request. More passengers filed into first class, each one taking notice of the oddly dressed man. Some did double takes, others whispered to their seatmates. A businessman in an Italian suit actually checked his ticket twice when he realized he was sitting across the aisle from the casual stranger. The flight attendants began their pre-flight routine, but the undercurrent of judgment continued. Catherine pulled out her phone, snapping a quick photo of her champagne glass with the man's worn jeans barely visible in the background. Her fingers flew across the screen as she typed out a message to her social media followers about maintaining standards in first class. Little did Catherine and her fellow passengers know that their quick judgments and assumptions were about to backfire spectacularly. The quiet man in seat 2 had a story that would soon leave them all feeling embarrassed and ashamed of their behavior. But for now, he simply sat there reading his book, a small, knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth as the whispers and judgmental glances continued around him. The first-class cabin settled into its pre-flight routine as the economy passengers filed past. Catherine Wheeler couldn't help but notice how several of them were actually dressed better than her seatmate. She pulled out her silk eye mask, then paused as a thought struck her. "Excuse me," she called out to Sarah, the lead flight attendant. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Her voice was sweet, but carried an edge that made several passengers look up from their phones and magazines. Sarah, a professional with 15 years of experience, approached with a practiced smile. "How can I help you, ma'am?" Catherine lowered her voice, but not enough to prevent others from hearing. I'm concerned about maintaining certain standards in first class. She glanced pointedly at the man next to her, who appeared absorbed in his book. Surely there must be some dress code policy. The whispers that had died down now started again with renewed interest. A businessman across the aisle set aside his laptop to watch. Two women in the row behind leaned forward slightly. I assure you, all our passengers have valid tickets, Sarah replied diplomatically. We don't discriminate based on appearance. Well, perhaps you should, Catherine persisted. Some of us pay a premium for a certain experience. She adjusted her pearl necklace for emphasis. The man in the worn jeans turned a page in his book, seemingly unaffected by the conversation about him. This somehow made Catherine even more frustrated. At the very least, she continued, her voice rising slightly, there should be some basic standards of presentation. I mean, look at those jeans. They look like they came from a thrift store. A few passengers nodded in agreement. One man in an expensive suit actually clapped quietly, encouraging Catherine's outburst. Sarah maintained her professional composure, though her smile had tightened. Ma'am, I understand your concerns, but all our passengers have the right to fly comfortably dressed. Just then, a young trainee flight attendant named Jenny approached with the pre-flight safety check. She stopped at their row and froze, her eyes widening as she looked at the man in 2A. Her clipboard slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor. Is everything all right? Sarah asked, turning to her colleague. Jenny quickly picked up her clipboard, her hands shaking slightly. She glanced at the man again, then at her clipboard, then back at the man. Her reaction caught the attention of several nearby passengers. Yes, everything's fine, Jenny stammered. Aren't you? The man in the worn jeans looked up from his book and gave her a kind smile. Yes, I am, he said quietly, but please, don't worry about it. Catherine looked between Jenny and her seatmate, confusion replacing her previous smugness. Something was happening, but she couldn't quite figure out what. Oh my God, whispered one of the women behind them. I knew he looked familiar. The businessman across the aisle suddenly sat up straighter, his face turning an interesting shade of red as recognition dawned. Sarah, the lead flight attendant, had also realized who their casual passenger was. Her professional smile transformed into one of genuine warmth. Can I get you anything else, Mr. Reeves? She asked. The name hung in the air like a thunderclap. Catherine Wheeler felt all the blood drain from her face. Her perfectly manicured hands gripped the armrests as she realized she had just spent the last 15 minutes loudly insulting Keanu Reeves, one of Hollywood's most beloved actors, known as much for his kindness and humility as for his films. The first-class cabin, so recently full of judgmental whispers, had fallen completely silent. The only sound was the gentle hum of the aircraft's engines and the soft rustle as Keanu Reeves, still wearing his worn jeans and simple t-shirt, turned another page in his book. The revelation of Keanu Reeves' identity spread through the first-class cabin like wildfire. Jenny, the young trainee flight attendant, was still standing there, clutching her clipboard to her chest, her face flushed with excitement. Other passengers were now turning in their seats, trying to get a better look at the Hollywood star they had so quickly judged. I can't believe it's really you, Jenny finally managed to say. My sister and I watched The Matrix just last night. It's our favorite movie of all time. Her voice trembled slightly with nervous energy. Keanu looked up from his book with a genuine smile. That's wonderful, he said warmly. What's your sister's name? Sarah. Well, actually everyone calls her Sari, Jenny replied, gaining confidence from his kindness. She's battling cancer right now, but your movies always cheer her up during chemotherapy. The cabin fell even quieter at this personal revelation. Catherine Wheeler, still frozen in embarrassment beside Keanu, felt her cheeks burn even hotter. She remembered reading somewhere about Keanu's own sister's battle with leukemia, but couldn't recall the details. Would you like me to sign something for Sari? Keanu asked, reaching for his backpack, the same one Catherine had sneered at earlier. He pulled out a small notepad and pen. Jenny's eyes filled with tears. Would you really? Oh my God, she's going to flip out. As Keanu wrote a personal message to Sari, other passengers began whispering among themselves, but this time the tone was completely different. Gone were the judgmental comments about his clothes. Instead, people were sharing stories they'd heard about his generosity and kindness. I heard he gave away most of his Matrix earnings to the special effects team, one businessman whispered to his seatmate. My cousin saw him on the subway in New York, another passenger added, said he gave up his seat to an elderly lady without hesitation. A woman 2 rows back was frantically searching on her phone. Look at this article, she told her companion. He's been secretly funding children's hospitals for years, never wanted any credit for it. Catherine sat rigidly in her seat, feeling smaller with each news story that circulated. She watched as Keanu finished writing his note to Sari, adding a small sketch beside his signature. Jenny accepted it with trembling hands and tears of joy. Wait, Keanu said gently, would you like to take a photo too? For your sister? Jenny's face lit up even more, if that was possible. Really? Is that okay? Of course, he smiled, standing up. He was much taller than Jenny, so he crouched down slightly to be at her eye level for the photo. Sarah, the lead flight attendant, offered to take the picture with Jenny's phone. As they posed for the photo, other passengers watched in amazement. Here was a man they had judged so harshly just minutes ago, showing nothing but kindness and humility. The same jeans and t-shirt they had criticized now seemed to represent something entirely different. A genuine person who didn't need expensive clothes to prove his worth. My sister won't believe this, Jenny said, checking the photo. This will mean so much to her. Tell her to stay strong, Keanu replied softly. And remember, like in The Matrix, sometimes the most important things aren't what we can see on the surface. The profound silence that followed his words was interrupted only by the sound of Catherine Wheeler's expensive pen slipping from her fingers and rolling under her seat. She made no move to retrieve it, too overwhelmed by the stark contrast between her earlier behavior and the quiet dignity of the man beside her. As Jenny returned to her duties, visibly walking on air, the other passengers tried to return to their pre-flight activities. But the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted dramatically. The same people who had been so quick to judge based on appearances were now stealing glances at Keanu with a mixture of admiration and shame, wondering how they could have been so wrong about someone based on something as superficial as clothing. As the plane reached its cruising altitude, Sarah, the lead flight attendant, began serving drinks to the first-class passengers. When she reached Keanu's row, she couldn't help but share something that had been on her mind. Mr. Reeves, she said softly, I just wanted to say that my nephew was at the children's hospital you visited in Boston last month. You spent hours playing video games with the kids there. He hasn't stopped talking about it since. Keanu looked up from his book with genuine interest. How is your nephew doing now? Much better, thank you. He's in remission. Sarah's eyes grew misty. The doctors said that keeping the children's spirits up is just as important as the medicine. Your visit meant everything to those kids. The conversation caught the attention of nearby passengers, including Catherine Wheeler, who was still sitting uncomfortably in her seat, trying to become invisible. Are you headed to another hospital visit? Sarah asked, arranging drinks on her cart. Keanu nodded quietly. Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York. They're doing amazing work with childhood cancer research. He paused for a moment before adding, my sister Kim fought leukemia for 10 years. She's the real warrior. A passenger in the row behind them was typing rapidly on his phone. Oh my God, he whispered to his seatmate. Look at this, he's donated millions to cancer research over the years, all anonymously. The news spread quickly through the cabin. Passengers began discovering more details about Keanu's quiet philanthropy. Someone found an article about how he had started a private foundation to fund children's hospitals and cancer research, never attaching his name to the donations. It says here he took a huge pay cut from his Matrix sequels so the costume and special effects teams could get better pay. Another passenger read from their phone. Jenny, the young trainee flight attendant, returned to their row with tears in her eyes. Mr. Reeves, I just called my sister during our break to tell her about meeting you. She's having a rough day with her treatment, but she started crying happy tears when I told her about your message. Keanu reached into his worn backpack again, the same backpack that had earlier been the subject of such derision. He pulled out a small silver pin in the shape of a motorcycle. This is from my last movie, he explained, handing it to Jenny. Could you give this to your sister too? Tell her it's a reminder to keep moving forward, no matter what. Catherine Wheeler watched this exchange, her expensive champagne untouched in front of her. She noticed how Keanu's simple t-shirt and jeans seemed to make him more approachable to people like Jenny. While she had spent the morning judging his appearance, he had been preparing to spend his day bringing joy to sick children. A businessman across the aisle cleared his throat. "Mr. Reeves, I apologize for my behavior earlier. We were all—" "No apology needed," Keanu interrupted gently. "We all have our moments of quick judgment. What matters is how we learn from them." The truth about Keanu's character continued to emerge throughout the flight. Passengers discovered stories about him giving up his seat on the subway, buying ice cream for a fan who was too shy to approach him, and helping stranded passengers when their flight was diverted to a small town. Each new revelation made Catherine sink further into her seat. Her earlier complaints about maintaining standards in first class now seemed not just shallow, but cruel. She watched as Keanu continued to interact warmly with the flight crew, never once mentioning the way he had been treated earlier. The worn jeans, simple t-shirt, and basic backpack that had seemed so out of place in first class now told a different story. They spoke of a man who chose to spend his money on helping others rather than on impressing strangers. They revealed someone who understood that true class had nothing to do with designer labels or expensive suits. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had changed completely. Where there had once been judgment and whispers of criticism, there was now a sense of collective shame and admiration. Catherine Wheeler, who had been the most vocal critic of Keanu's appearance, was experiencing the most dramatic transformation of all. As she sat there, thinking about everything she had learned in the past hour, her phone buzzed. It was a notification from her social media post, the one where she had complained about maintaining standards in first class. The comments were flooding in, and they weren't kind. "Is that Keanu Reeves in the background?" One comment read. "The man who's donated millions to children's hospitals. Those shabby jeans probably cost less than your handbag, but he's busy saving lives while you're busy judging," said another. Catherine's hands shook as she quickly deleted the post, but screenshots had already started circulating. Her face burned with embarrassment as she realized how her attempt to shame someone had backfired spectacularly. Across the aisle, the businessman who had earlier applauded Catherine's complaints was now on his phone, showing his seatmate article after article about Keanu's good deeds. "Did you know he gave away Harley-Davidson motorcycles to his entire stunt crew on The Matrix?" he whispered, loud enough for others to hear. "And he never wanted any credit for it." 2 rows behind, a young executive who had smirked at Keanu's casual attire was now telling his colleague about how Keanu had helped a stranded woman fix her car on a highway and then gave her a ride to her destination. "He could have called her a tow truck or just driven past like most celebrities would," the executive said, "but he stopped and helped himself. In the rain." Jenny, the trainee flight attendant, had shared the story of her interaction with Keanu in the crew area, and now other flight attendants found excuses to pass by their row, each sharing their own small moments of connection with the star. "My cousin's child was at that children's hospital in LA when you visited last year," one flight attendant said as she collected empty cups. "You spent hours playing board games with the kids. They still talk about it." Catherine watched as Keanu responded to each story and commented with genuine humility and warmth. He never mentioned his wealth or fame, never bragged about his charitable works, and never once gave any indication that he had noticed the dramatic shift in how his fellow passengers were treating him. The transformation wasn't just in how people viewed Keanu, it was in how they began to view themselves. The designer clothes and expensive accessories that had seemed so important earlier now felt superficial and meaningless. A woman in an expensive business suit 2 rows ahead was quietly removing her diamond bracelet and placing it in her bag, as if suddenly conscious of its ostentation. The businessman who had checked his ticket twice when he realized he was sitting near Keanu was now looking thoughtfully at his own $3,000 suit. The most telling transformation was in the cabin's atmosphere itself. The invisible barriers that first-class passengers often built between themselves and others had dissolved. People were talking to each other, sharing stories, and reflecting on their own prejudices. Sarah, the lead flight attendant, noticed the change too. In her 15 years of flying, she had never seen a first-class cabin feel so human. The usual air of superiority and entitlement had been replaced by something warmer and more genuine. As the flight continued, passengers who had spent the first part of the journey trying to display their wealth and status were now competing to share stories about kindness and generosity they had witnessed or experienced. It was as if Keanu's presence had reminded them all that true class had nothing to do with what you wore or how much money you had. It was about how you treated others. As the flight reached its halfway point, a small commotion started at the back of the first-class cabin. An elderly woman was trying to reach the bathroom, struggling with her walking cane. Before any flight attendant could react, Keanu was already on his feet. "Let me help you, ma'am," he said quietly, offering his arm for support. The elderly woman, who hadn't been paying attention to the earlier drama, looked up at him with grateful eyes. "Oh, thank you, young man. These planes keep getting longer and longer, don't they?" As Keanu helped her navigate the aisle, Catherine Wheeler watched in amazement. The same man she had criticized for his appearance was now showing more class than anyone else on the flight. When they returned, the elderly woman, Mrs. Thompson, turned out to be quite talkative. "You remind me of my grandson," she told Keanu. "He's always helping people too. Are you traveling to New York for business or pleasure?" "A hospital visit," Keanu replied simply. "Oh dear, I hope you're not ill." Mrs. Thompson's concern was genuine. "No, ma'am. I'm visiting some special kids who are fighting much tougher battles than I ever have." The conversation caught everyone's attention. Even those pretending to read or work on their laptops were listening intently. "My late husband was a doctor," Mrs. Thompson shared. "He always said that laughter and kindness were the best medicines, better than any pill he could prescribe." Keanu smiled warmly. "Your husband sounds like a wise man. Actually, would you mind sharing some stories about him? I'm working on a project about healthcare workers, and I'd love to hear about his experiences." For the next 30 minutes, the first-class cabin was treated to Mrs. Thompson's stories about her husband's 40 years as a pediatrician. Keanu listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions and taking genuine interest in her memories. Other passengers gradually joined the conversation. A young doctor shared his own experiences working in children's hospitals. A teacher talked about her student who had recently finished cancer treatment. Even the flight attendants paused to listen when their duties allowed. "Would anyone like to see some pictures?" Mrs. Thompson asked, pulling out an old photo album from her carry-on bag. "I always carry these with me." Soon, a small group had gathered around her seat. Keanu sat on the floor in the aisle, his worn jeans and casual demeanor making the moment feel more like a family gathering than a first-class flight. "Look at this one," Mrs. Thompson said, pointing to a faded photograph. This was Tom's first day as chief of pediatrics. He was so nervous, he put his lab coat on backwards. The genuine laughter that followed seemed to break down the last remaining barriers in the cabin. Catherine Wheeler found herself smiling despite her earlier embarrassment. The businessman who had doubted Keanu's presence in first class was now sitting cross-legged in the aisle, listening to stories about a small-town hospital in the 1960s. Jenny, the trainee flight attendant, brought coffee and snacks for everyone, turning the moment into an impromptu gathering. No one cared anymore about designer labels or status symbols. The simple act of sharing stories had transformed the space. "You know," Mrs. Thompson said, looking at Keanu, "my Tom would have liked you. He never cared about fancy clothes or expensive things either. He used to say, 'The size of someone's heart matters more than the size of their wallet.'" The irony of her words wasn't lost on anyone, especially those who had been so quick to judge earlier. Keanu just smiled and helped Mrs. Thompson turn to the next page of her photo album, his genuine interest in her stories touching everyone who witnessed it. As the photo-sharing session with Mrs. Thompson came to a natural end, Catherine Wheeler found herself gathering all her courage. The weight of her earlier behavior had been sitting heavily on her shoulders throughout the flight, and she knew she needed to make things right. "Mr. Reeves," she said softly, her voice lacking its earlier sharp edge, "could I speak with you for a moment?" Keanu turned to her with the same gentle expression he'd worn all flight, even when she had been at her most critical. "Of course," he replied. Catherine took a deep breath. Her perfectly manicured hands were trembling slightly as she spoke. "I need to apologize for my behavior earlier. The things I said, the way I acted, it was inexcusable." The cabin grew quiet again. Everyone had witnessed her earlier outburst, and now they were witness to her apology. Some passengers pretended to be occupied with their devices, but they were all listening. "When I saw your clothes," Catherine continued, her voice growing steadier, "I made assumptions. I thought I knew exactly who you were and what you were worth. I've spent my whole career in fashion, teaching people that their worth is tied to what they wear. She paused, fighting back tears. I've never been more wrong about anything in my life. Keanu listened quietly, giving her his full attention. His silence encouraged her to continue. Today, you taught me that true class has nothing to do with designer labels or expensive suits. It's about how you treat others, especially when they're not treating you well. Catherine wiped a tear from her cheek, not caring that it smudged her perfect makeup. You know, Keanu finally spoke, his voice thoughtful. I learned something important early in my career. These clothes we wear, he gestured to his worn jeans, they're just costumes really. In movies, I wear whatever the character needs. In life, I wear what feels comfortable, but neither defines who I am. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small book. This is what I've been reading, he showed her. It was a worn copy of Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Frankl talks about how the most important thing in life is finding meaning through how we treat others, not through what we own or wear. Catherine looked at the book, then at her own expensive outfit. I've spent my whole career judging people by their covers, she admitted. Both books and people. It's never too late to start reading differently, Keanu replied with a small smile. By now, other passengers were openly watching their interaction. The businessman who had supported Catherine's earlier complaints spoke up. I need to apologize too, he said. I was just as judgmental. We all were, added another passenger. Jenny, who was passing by with the drink cart, stopped. You know what's amazing, she said. My sister always says that her hospital room feels like a judgment-free zone, like everyone there understands that what matters is on the inside. Your sister sounds very wise, Keanu said. Is she receiving treatment at Sloan Kettering? When Jenny nodded, Keanu wrote something in his small notebook. I'll make sure to stop by her room tomorrow. We can talk more about the Matrix. Catherine watched this exchange, feeling the last of her fashion industry armor falling away. Would it be okay, she asked hesitantly, if I made a donation to the hospital too? Anonymous, of course, like yours. Keanu smiled warmly. The kids would appreciate that. Although, he added with a gentle laugh, they'd probably appreciate some comfortable pajamas more than designer ones. For the first time in the flight, Catherine laughed too, a genuine laugh free from pretense. I think I'm finally learning the difference, she said. As the pilot announced their final descent into New York, the first-class cabin began its usual preparation for landing. But everything felt different now. The usual rush to pack up expensive laptops and straighten designer clothes was replaced by something more meaningful. Mrs. Thompson was carefully putting away her photo album when she realized she couldn't reach her bag in the overhead compartment. Before she could even ask for help, 3 passengers, including the businessman who had earlier been so judgmental, jumped up to assist her. Thank you, dears, she said warmly. You know, this has been the most pleasant flight I've had in years. Usually, first class is so quiet and cold. Jenny came through one last time to check that all seats were upright. Her phone buzzed with a message from her sister at the hospital. Mr. Reeves, she said, her eyes bright with tears. My sister just sent me a message. She said this was the best day of her entire treatment so far, just knowing you're coming to visit tomorrow. Keanu smiled warmly. Tell her to rest well. We have a lot of movies to discuss tomorrow. Catherine Wheeler, who had been quiet since her apology, suddenly spoke up. Jenny, what's your sister's favorite color? Purple, Jenny replied, surprised by the question. Catherine nodded, typing something on her phone. I'm having some comfortable purple pajamas and robes delivered to the hospital tomorrow. For all the kids on her floor. She looked at Keanu. It's a start, right? The plane began its descent, and the New York skyline came into view through the windows. The same passengers who had started the flight comparing their expensive watches and designer brands were now exchanging contact information, not for business connections, but to stay updated on Jenny's sister's progress and to coordinate their contributions to the children's hospital. Mr. Reeves, the businessman across the aisle, said, I know you probably get this all the time, but could we take a quick photo? Not for social media, he added quickly, just as a reminder of the lesson we learned today. Of course, Keanu replied, but let's make it a group photo. Mrs. Thompson, you should be in the center. You're the one who showed us what real storytelling looks like. As they arranged themselves for the photo, with Sarah, a flight attendant offering to take it, There wasn't a trace of the earlier judgment or division in the cabin. Keanu stood in his worn jeans and simple t-shirt. Mrs. Thompson sat with her walking cane. Catherine had removed her expensive jacket, and everyone was simply human. The plane touched down smoothly at JFK Airport. As they taxied to the gate, Jenny made one final announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to New York. Thank you for flying with us today, and thank you for showing that kindness is always in first class." When the seatbelt sign turned off, something unusual happened. Instead of the usual rush to be first off the plane, the first-class passengers waited. They helped Mrs. Thompson gather her things, made sure she had support walking down the aisle, and treated each other with a newfound respect. Keanu was the last to leave, helping the flight crew clean up some scattered papers and ensuring nothing was left behind. As he stepped off the plane, Catherine called out one last time, "Mr. Reeves?" He turned back. "Thank you," she said simply. "Not for being a movie star, but for being a teacher today." He smiled and adjusted his worn backpack on his shoulder. "We're all teachers and students," he replied. "Sometimes we just forget which role we're playing." As the first-class passengers dispersed into the busy terminal, they carried with them something more valuable than their expensive luggage. A lesson about true worth that no designer label could ever provide.